Welcome to Human School. I'm Dr. Patil Armenian, and each episode I'll share some of my personal stories, interview inspiring people, and offer tools to help you with the mission of being a human on Earth. Hi everyone, and welcome to Human School. You may or may not know that I'm an emergency physician and a medical toxicologist at a large academic hospital. This means I take care of patients, teach medical students, residents, and fellows, and also do research. So within all of this, my special area of interest and expertise is in psychedelic safety and the toxicology of psychedelics. So I'm obsessed with this topic. I'm obsessed with psychedelics, and if I'm obsessed, then you get to hear about it too. I've done a few other episodes touching on some topics and people within psychedelics, but they have really been in the news lately. So I wanted to talk about why are they in the news, interview some of my friends in the field who are true experts to dig a little bit deeper into this topic. So let's get into the latest news. Like, what do I mean when I say there's some news happening? Because there's been a lot of growth and movement in this field in the last 40 years, especially in the last 15 years. But a lot of stuff has happened in the last month. On April 18, 2026, an executive order was signed by the president to expedite approvals for psychedelic-assisted therapies. So there were a few major points in this executive order. The first was fast tracking for psychedelic drug development, basically advising that the FDA commissioner's national priority voucher system be used for psychedelic drug development. The other was about right to try, so giving those with life-threatening illness the possibility of trying psychedelics, which has been rejected in the past. There was $50 million promised in federal funds to support psychedelic research. There's just a general commentary about increasing clinical trials participation and evidence. I don't know how you make that happen, except just by at least saying you support it in the executive order. And the other one is that it does advise that if a psychedelic has cleared past phase 3 clinical trials and that they have received FDA approval, then they could be rescheduled by the DEA. This was already something that was kind of going to happen anyways, but at least it puts it in writing. And psychedelics is not a topic that is often mentioned by presidents of the United States. And in fact, since Nixon banning LSD and starting the war on drugs, these compounds hadn't really been mentioned in the Oval Office. So just that is very interesting and I think is very bipartisan. So this has been a very seemingly fast-moving development, but in the works for years. Now, the FDA commissioner, Marty Makary, immediately commented that priority vouchers would in fact be given to psychedelic studies, specifically 3. Then on April 24, the FDA did announce that 3 commissioners' national priority vouchers were going to be given for psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. Now, psilocybin is the magic mushrooms that people used to call magic mushrooms. So one for psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, another for psilocybin for major depressive disorder, and then a third one, methylone for PTSD. Methylone is a phenethylamine that is very closely related to MDMA. MDMA is otherwise known as ecstasy or Molly. That is what methylone is, and it is a compound that was invented by Sasha Shulgin and his colleague Peyton Jacob. I talk in one of my past episodes a lot about Sasha Shulgin and his legacy. Now, the 3 companies that got the vouchers are Compass Pathways, Usona Institute, and Transcend. Transcend is being acquired by pharmaceutical giant Otsuka Pharmaceuticals. And I thought it was actually interesting that Resilient Pharmaceuticals, formerly known as Lykos, that did the MDMA trials for PTSD were not included. But also, I think it has to do with where they are at in the studies. So their phase 3 trials were done, and although the FDA recommended they do repeat phase 3 trials, we'll have to wait and see what's going on with that. I'm not an expert in this, but what these priority vouchers might do is to speed up some of the approval process. But when you have a company that's already close to the finish line, then if they can reanalyze their data and resubmit, that might be faster than needing a priority voucher such as this. Again, I'm not a total expert in this. I'm speculating along with everyone else. So we'll just kind of see what will happen and what will happen with these 3 priority vouchers that have been given. But right after this past week, Marty Makary left the FDA. He resigned, and the FDA has been continuing to experience a lot of flux in this administration. A lot of people have left. So again, it's kind of interesting to see what's going to happen within the FDA. I will say, though, that you can't speed up the process of a clinical trial itself. Like, the studies still need to happen. They still need to be done properly with appropriate mental and physical safety measures. So there's only so much speeding up that can be done. It might be just on the order of months rather than years. So the FDA commissioner stuff is important, but then also allocating $50 million in federal funds for psychedelic research. That'll be interesting to see where that goes. In the land of clinical trials and drug development, I hate to say it, but $50 million is not a lot of money, but it's far better than zero. Anyway, there's a lot happening. So I thought, let me talk to some of my friends who are actual experts in the field so that we can learn more about what's going on in the news. This week, I speak to the wonderful Ismail Lourido Ali, who is the co-executive director of MAPS. Next week, I'll talk to the most cutting-edge psychedelic neuroscientist, Dr. Gul Dolan, so make sure you look out for her episode 2. For those of you who don't know, MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They're celebrating their 40th anniversary this year, which is amazing. The amount of work they've done in the psychedelic field is unparalleled. It is a nonprofit organization that, as they describe themselves, they provide public resources and leadership as we work together to create responsible, evidence-based pathways to psychedelics. That's a great sentence, but I think that it doesn't quite properly express all the work that they've done through the years, including doing the first MDMA for PTSD trials ever done. Ismail himself has been actively participating in drug policy reform movement for over a decade, informed by half a lifetime of diverse personal experience with psychedelics and other substances. He was previously the director of policy and advocacy at MAPS, and in that time supported the design, building, and implementation of psychedelic policy reform across the country and the world. He is a lawyer, and he also co-founded and co-chaired the board of the Psychedelic Bar Association and is licensed to practice law in California. Ismail has advised, is formally affiliated with, or has served in leadership roles for numerous organizations in the drug policy ecosystem. So we're going to get into my conversation with him in a moment. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Human School. Ismail Ali, co-director of MAPS.
Hello. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, Patil.
I'm really excited to have you on because if there's anybody that's an expert in the psychedelic landscape, it's you. And we've been talking in this episode about how much has been just very recently happening. Like in the last couple of weeks, a lot of psychedelics news has been generated from Washington, D.C., with the executive order and then with the FDA announcing 3 priority vouchers. So first off, I just wanted to get your opinion as the current co-leader of MAPS, what you think about all of it.
Yeah, so one helpful frame, I'll give you my answer to this question, but one helpful frame is that a lot has happened in the last month or a couple months, and any one of the things that happened in the last couple of months is a big deal, and there's been like half a dozen. So the executive order had, a few different aspects, and maybe what I'll do is explain those very quickly, just so the audience has a little of that context, then I can give my opinion because there's some nuance there, right? The executive order itself had a few different elements. One, which we can get to at the end, is the priority review vouchers, which then a few days later were actually allocated, which would accelerate approval timelines primarily for breakthrough therapy drugs, which is a designation that's given by the FDA for drugs that perform particularly well when it comes to efficacy relative to existing treatments. And some substances in this category, like MDMA and psilocybin and LSD, while not all of those drugs have received priority vouchers, or not all of those drug developers have received priority vouchers, all fall into this breakthrough therapy category. What's interesting is that the sort of threshold moment that we're in for ibogaine specifically made a lot of people, when they read it or heard the executive order, kind of conflate those things. But ibogaine, just to clarify, does not yet have breakthrough therapy designation. So it doesn't qualify necessarily for the accelerated approval timeline yet. It may in the future. But what is relevant for ibogaine is that it does qualify for the $50 million in funding that is now being allocated from the federal government for psychedelic research, including potentially ibogaine research. It also explains these pathways called right to try, which are not like compassionate use or expanded access, which are programs through the FDA that allow for patients who are seeking treatments to receive treatments that have not yet been all the way through the approval process. I think they have to get through phase 2, and then there's this kind of expanded access within phase 3. Whereas right to try is sort of similar, where it's pre-approval access, but it's directly between a patient, their medical provider, and the drug development companies themselves. So the dynamics are a little bit different, but that's been something that a number of folks, including some of my colleagues in the legal field, in the psychedelic legal field, have been working on for a while, which is allowing patients to have that right to access independent of the FDA system. And then finally, just broadly speaking, what the executive order does is direct federal agencies, which, by the way, are the ones that are under the executive branch's control. So this is what an executive order does. The president is able to direct federal agencies. It can't direct the entire mechanism of the entire country. A lot of that's under Congress or under the judiciary, to accelerate and to modernize timelines. So that's accelerating the timelines, but it's also smoothing out some of the communication pathways between the different entities involved, between the National Institute of Drug Abuse and the DEA and the FDA and these different bodies. So I start there because my opinion about, or how to think about, the executive order really hinges on what it is, what is included, and then of course
Yes.
what is the larger political context. So what I'll say is, on one hand, $50 million from the federal government ain't nothing. That's significant, and it is the largest allocation of funds from the federal government so far. Congress has allocated some funds through the NIH, through the Department of Defense, and also through the VA to do some psychedelic research over the last couple of years. So we have a couple like $10 or $20 million allocations that have come through Congress in the last few years, which is, these are big deals, big deals. And this 50 million allocation, which is sort of, people think of it as matching the amount that the Texas state legislature put toward ibogaine research a couple of years ago, is the largest amount from the federal government. That is a big sign and a threshold, no matter how you slice it. And a lot of the, let's say, the directive to modernize and to improve communication between the different federal agencies, a very good thing. We want to see that kind of happening. What we don't want is for anyone, whether it's the federal government or industry or whoever else, to put a thumb on the scale and override consumer protection or public health or the rights or needs of patients in approving a drug. So we want to maintain the sort of evidentiary standards while also making it possible for these different agencies to do their work and to do their jobs better in a way that's still really aligned with the needs of patients. So that's one. And then the other thing that I just have to say is that I think it's important to understand this in the larger context, not just of like the politics of the administration, although we can get into that if we want, but even just within this range. It is also true that, as we recently saw also with SAMHSA, also under HHS, Health and Human Services, this massive disinvestment in harm reduction services, in the types of funding that would support mental health, social work, other things. And one thing that I like to remind people is, while it is unquestionably a threshold and an important shift for anyone, any sitting president, but especially this administration, to move forward funding from the federal government for psychedelic research in the context of the VA, in the context of these other things, it's also important to understand that as I'm sure you know, and as I'm sure your listeners understand, it's not just about the medicine, it's also about the infrastructure to deliver it. And we got to see these things kind of in
Yes.
context. Yeah.
Yes, it's just one small part of a very
Hmm.
large puzzle. And so if you think
Hmm.
about psychedelics as, oh, well, this is the thing that's going to cure everything, it's like, well, if everything else around you is falling apart and you're not supported, then it's not going to do the thing. Like you really do need all the pieces in place properly.
Yeah. And I think it's still possible to get there, and it's not going to happen by itself, you could say. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a ton of work to do, right?
Hmm.
So, one of the interesting things I read was just people acting like prohibition is over. And I am not hearing that from you, right? Like
Hmm.
that is not what this executive order means.
Yeah, I can say that I really loved to hear, Brian Hubbard was the one who said that in the thing, and I really love to hear
Mhm.
that enthusiasm. And I do think sometimes as social movements as a form of science fiction, not in like a diminishing way, but in like we're imagining the reality that we want to see. And I do think that this is unquestionably a sign that we're moving toward a shift in the certainly American drug control paradigm. Because yes, it's a research allocation, but that does signify a changing of the larger attitude. And to your question, the executive order made a very big difference and will make the most difference for drug developers, some researchers, pharmaceutical companies. Progress in one sense, but I think from the perspective of the average person, whether they're suffering from an opioid use disorder, and maybe they'll see downstream effects of this, which is what we hope, right? When you look at the advocates that are behind this, that's what they hope for. They want this to be something that can benefit people who are dealing with the, I won't even say aftermath, the current math, the current reality of
Mhm.
the kind of overdose and just substance related crisis here in the United States. So I believe that patients can still, we hope that can and will see benefit from this move going forward. And, as my co-executive director, Betty, likes to say, I really like the way that she's put this in a couple of conversations we've had lately, which is that in some ways this makes the work of the movement, of the work that we're holding at MAPS and others, even more urgent. Because what that's doing, it's like it's important to see the advancement in pharmaceutical medicine and access and so on. And we got to make sure that people don't get left behind. And you're a
Yes.
medical professional, you've been working in this field your entire life, like you see, and I don't think this is a controversial thing to say, that there's a lot of places that medicine does really right, and there's a lot of things that Western medicine leaves behind. And I think for us as a movement, as like a psychedelic movement, the way that I've been thinking about this is like, how do we make sure that we don't leave people behind, which is by including more than just medical access in our worldview. So medical access means insurance coverage. That is a life-changing reality for people that I don't want to diminish. And it's really critical to bring forward and visibilize the ways that the movement, the human relationships within this larger field, is going to be the container that holds this shift going forward. Because just to go one step further, like thing about psychedelics is that, and I think a study to this end came out fairly recently that kind of really demonstrated this. It's not like aspirin. If I take aspirin in my car or on my desk or in my backyard, aspirin does the same thing every time pretty consistently. But if I took psychedelics in my backyard or at my desk or in my car, which I wouldn't do, by the way, don't try that at home or anywhere,
Nope.
the effects are really different. It's not just because it alters the state, but because the context, the set and setting of the substance impacts its behavior. That's totally different from how a lot of psychopharmacology, pharmacological medicine works. I'm telling this to you, who's living
Yeah.
experience, right? Like,
No, but
so,
people
so I do
listening
think that
don't
that's a
know that.
critical thing, right? And I think that's a critical thing for us to think when we're, yes, it is promising to see this advancement and this awareness that, like, oh yeah, we should actually be looking at scientific evidence and research and how we do drug policy. Sounds really radical, but like finally we're catching up to that. But to your point, I don't think that alone will end the drug war, or I would say even end prohibition. I do think that we're seeing the cracks in the wall and we're starting to see the beginning of what could be the new paradigm, but it's going to take all of us. And respectfully, the pharmaceutical companies are not going to do it alone.
Yeah. And no, and they shouldn't. I think it's really interesting how it's just taken on such a pharmaceutical bent, and everybody's talking about ibogaine right now, and that is a topic that I'm very interested in, especially as a toxicologist. We'll do other episodes on that. But in that context, I always think, well, are we talking about where it comes from? and who are the people using it? I'm referencing the Bwiti tribe in
Hmm.
Gabon,
Hmm.
and are these groups being left out of
Yeah.
conversations?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to this. So, just one small respectful correction. Bwiti is a spiritual cosmology. It's not a single tribe. It's actually many tribes that
Okay,
practice Bwiti. That this is a common
thank you.
misconception, and it's all good, all good. And I still think it's worth naming because it's like it's a
No, it
worldview and a
is.
religion, a form of spirituality that's important to be named in this conversation. And what I'll say is, so I'm on a bit of a learning tour. I've been following this issue in different ways for a decade at least now. And I don't know if you know this, but I was initiated in the Sumba, which is one of the traditional rites in Gabon with Iboga about a year and a half ago. So I went there and spent some time and really dove in that sense. Since then, I've been on this really deep learning tour, and in the last month since the executive order, have been going like even deeper in understanding like how is this whole conversation working. I'm still understanding it myself, so I want to be careful not to speak outside of what I know so far. But
Yes.
I'll share this. I'll share a couple of things on that. One, so especially for listeners that don't know, iboga, which is the plant from which ibogaine is derived, or I should say one of the plants, one of the primary ones, and the one where it has the highest concentration. It's not the only one. It grows almost exclusively in Central West Africa, specifically inside of the country of Gabon, with some also in Cameroon and in Congo, which are all in that region of Africa. And the tribes, of which there are many that have worked with iboga over, depending on who's counting, 600, 6,000 years, work in a lot of different ways. So in similar, like where you see in the United States, you have many different tribal groups, or in Mexico, we have
Mm-hmm.
many different tribal groups who work with peyote. They all have different kind of shades, but they all kind of have this cosmology around this plant at the center of it, or this is part of that kind of larger pantheon of future plants and relationships to nature broadly. And one thing that's very interesting is that Gabon has among the highest, if it might even be the highest percentage, like per capita, per mile, or per square space of protected land out of almost any country in the world. Like 80% of Gabon is protected land. And what that means is that the government of Gabon is very sophisticated and active in its understanding of how to protect its resources relative to external actors. So you can imagine a place with like Gabon with a history of colonization by the French, active engagement and investment by large international geopolitical actors for the resources that they have there. It's not their first rodeo. It's not the first time they've seen an external actor of any kind to come in and be like, hey, we're interested in that thing that you've got over there. So the thing that's very different about this situation that has not been true for others, with psychedelics in particular, is that you have a government. The last two presidents of Gabon are initiated into Iboga traditions. And so it's a very different situation where you have like a government who understands this issue, who is in
Yeah.
the conversation for the I mean, I don't know of another example. So it's like, the Mexican government knows that traditional use happens in Peruvian, Colombian, Brazilian, but they all relate to it in different ways. And none of them are like, this is our cultural patrimony that we're going to
Mm-hmm.
protect in our own way. So what that means is that we have an engagement at the table, or an actor at the table, stakeholders at the table that you haven't really seen with other psychedelics before. That's very, very substantial. Now, the complex thing there is that I don't know any government that perfectly represents the interest of all of its people. So what happens is you have these tribal groups within Gabon who have different levels of engagement with this topic, some of whom are more and less represented by government or industry or iced out, just like you do in any other place. So I bring this up to say that I think that it is very significant and a major sign, an important sign, that when you have the state of Texas, the state of Colorado, at least in the US, that are really actively engaging with the question of Iboga and Ibogaine. There's a huge stakeholder process happening in Colorado right now because the state of Colorado legalized, regulated use of these medicines. It's trying to do so with Ibogaine right now, which was included within that Natural Medicine Health Act. And they're trying to do it in a way that's in relationship to the tribal groups that these medicines are from, because none of those medicines grow in Colorado. Well, mushrooms definitely do. But like Iboga doesn't naturally grow there, ayahuasca doesn't naturally grow there. So they're doing this consultation within the state with leadership from these tribal groups from outside of the country. Like it's like never before seen kind of stuff here. So and
Yeah.
I think it's really cool because what's happening is you're seeing these like new forms of responsibility and accountability and reciprocity from the US psychedelic ecosystem, which so far, like most drug policy in the United States, has sort of engaged with this with the almost like a consumer protection level. A lot of harm reduction, it's at the point of consumption. or we have to make sure that people who are overdosing and using the drugs are safe. And that's really important. No shade to that. But now, this conversation with Iboga and Ibogaine and psychedelics broadly is sort of forcing us to be aware, oh, these are international conversations. We can't just think about Americans' interests here. And I think that I think that's a deep point of growth and sophistication that I'm really glad to see. Where it's going to go, that's sort of what I'm educating myself now. And maybe next time we talk, I'll have better answers. But I'll leave it at that for now, because that's what I know to be true. That this engagement is happening in a way that's never been before seen.
That's like pretty groundbreaking and very interesting because, yeah, I wonder where it is going to go. I don't know. Next time.
Next
I think
time.
that's a good place to end. Thank
Okay.
you so
Okay.
much
Yeah.
for coming on, and we'll talk again soon.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you're sharing this conversation with your folks. I look forward to next time. Take care, Patil.
Thank you. Please like, subscribe, share, and download the podcast. And again, you can find us at Human School Podcast on Instagram. I'd like to thank Dr. Zach Effron for the theme music. And I'd just like to make a general disclaimer that any of the institutions I work for, including Community Regional Medical Center, UCSF Fresno, and American Ambulance, have nothing to do with any of my thoughts or opinions, and so we'll kindly leave them out of this. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.